I had just got my brand new Dodge Challenger off the lot 3 days ago. The paint still smelled fresh. The engine still roared like it had something to prove, and every time I saw it parked in my driveway, I couldn't help but grin. It wasn't just a car to me. It was a symbol of all the overtime hours I had worked, all the weekends I had sacrificed, and every bit of self-control I had exercised to save the down payment. My job as a construction project manager paid decently, but it wasn't glamorous money. I had been careful, living simply, driving my old truck until the wheels were practically begging to fall off. And when the time was right, I went out and bought the car I had always dreamed of. My Challenger was black with matte stripes running down the center, a beast that looked like it had rolled right out of a muscle car magazine. And it was mine, completely, proudly mine. My house sat in a tidy, HOA-controlled neighborhood. I had moved here mostly because of its proximity to my work site and the relatively quiet streets. But from the day I moved in, I could tell that the HOA board was made up of the kind of people who had too much time on their hands. You know the type. Clipboard warriors, patrolling the neighborhood like it was their own private kingdom, measuring grass height, and leaving notes on windshields if you parked too close to the sidewalk. I kept my head down and played by the rules, even when they seemed ridiculous, because I wasn't interested in drama. At least, not until the day my new car became the latest obsession of our neighborhood's self-appointed queen bee, Karen. Karen lived 2 houses down from me, and if there was a human embodiment of every internet joke about Karens, it was her. Short blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, permanent scowl. She was the type who loved reminding everyone of the HOA's power. She always had a comment, whether it was about where your trash bins were stored or whether your American flag was properly displayed. She was the loudest voice at every HOA meeting, and I had overheard her once bragging that nothing in the neighborhood happened without her approval. Lucky me, on the day it all went down, I had just finished washing my Challenger in the driveway. The sun was setting, giving the black paint job that perfect glossy reflection that made it look like a mirror. I was sitting on a lawn chair, beer in hand, just admiring my work when I saw Karen walking her tiny white dog down the street. Even from a distance, I could tell she had that look, chin up, lips pursed, like she was looking for something to complain about. Sure enough, her gaze zeroed in on my car like a heat-seeking missile. She slowed her walk, stared at it, then at me, and then kept walking, whispering something under her breath. I ignored her. I figured maybe she'd send me a passive-aggressive HOA email later about unsightly vehicles or some nonsense, but nothing could prepare me for what came next. The next morning, I stepped outside to head to work, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, and froze. My Challenger was sitting in the driveway, but the entire driver's side was keyed from the front fender all the way to the rear quarter panel. Deep scratches, the kind that would take more than just a buff job to fix. My heart dropped into my stomach, then rage lit my chest like fire. I knew right away it wasn't some random act. This was personal. And I didn't have many enemies. Just one person who had made it clear she didn't think my car fit the neighborhood aesthetic. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my breathing steady. My neighbors were already starting to leave for work, and a few slowed their cars to look at the damage, shaking their heads sympathetically, but saying nothing. That was the problem with HOA neighborhoods. No one wanted to get involved. I pulled out my phone and went straight to my security camera app. I had installed cameras around the house last year after someone stole a package off my porch. I scrolled back through the footage from the night before, and sure enough, there she was, Karen, wearing a hoodie like a teenager trying to sneak out after curfew, but there was no mistaking her dog, trotting along happily as she dragged a key down the side of my brand new car. My hands were shaking now, but it wasn't fear, it was fury. I couldn't believe the audacity. I had evidence. Cold, hard proof, and I knew exactly what to do with it. I called the police, filed a report, and gave them the footage. They said they'd follow up, but I knew how slow that process could be. I wasn't about to sit around while Karen went about her day like nothing had happened. I had work to get to, but I couldn't focus on anything except that image of her casually destroying my car, like it was some kind of game. By lunchtime, I had already gotten a call from a neighbor who told me Karen was bragging in the HOA Facebook group about how certain people needed to learn to respect the neighborhood guidelines and that she had taken care of the problem. That was it. That was the last straw. I didn't want revenge. I needed it. And I needed it now. I left work early, drove straight home in my scratched-up Challenger, and parked it in plain view. Then I got on the phone and called a buddy of mine who owned a tow truck business. I told him the situation, sent the video, and he laughed so hard he nearly dropped the phone. "Say no more," he said. "Text me the address." When he rolled up half an hour later, I pointed him right at Karen's shiny white Lexus SUV, parked perfectly in her driveway, like a smug little trophy. He didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he had that Lexus hooked up and ready to go. I stood there with my arms crossed as he towed it right out of the neighborhood. A couple of neighbors peeked through their blinds. A few even came outside to watch, and I could feel their silent applause. It was the most satisfying moment I'd had in years. When Karen finally came home and saw the empty driveway, her scream echoed down the street. I didn't even try to hide my grin. She stormed over to my house, red-faced and shouting, demanding to know what I'd done. I just pointed to my security camera and said, "You smashed my car, Karen. Actions have consequences." Karen didn't just storm back to her house that day. She practically stomped a hole through her own porch with how hard she was marching. Her dog barked nervously as she fumbled with her phone, and I knew exactly what she was doing. Calling the HOA president. Sure enough, within 20 minutes, the HOA president, a tall, balding man named Greg, appeared at her front door, clipboard in hand like he was about to write me up for breathing wrong. Greg was one of those men who thought the HOA bylaws were holy scripture, and he loved reminding everyone that he had been on the board for nearly a decade. He didn't knock on my door first. No. He and Karen stood in her driveway talking and pointing in my direction, their voices getting louder and louder until Karen was nearly screaming. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough: retaliation, illegal towing, community standards. Finally, Greg strutted over my front porch like he owned the place. I stepped outside before he could knock, leaning against the doorway, my arms crossed. "Greg," I said calmly. "Do you know what you just done?" he asked, his voice dripping with self-importance. "Yeah," I said. "I towed the car of the woman who vandalized my property. You want to see the video?" He blinked at me, clearly thrown off by how casually I said it, then shook his head. "This isn't how we resolve disputes in this neighborhood. You can't just have someone's vehicle towed off private property. She vandalized my brand new car, Greg." I interrupted, pulling up the video on my phone and holding it out. "That's a felony. You think I'm just going to let her get away with it because she's on your little board?" Greg hesitated, glancing between the screen and Karen's house. I could tell he didn't want to get involved, but Karen must have been watching from behind her blinds because she suddenly appeared again, shouting across the street about lawsuits and how I was harassing her. That was when my patience broke. "Harassment?" I shouted back. "You keyed my car, Karen. You think you can run this neighborhood like a dictatorship, and no one will stand up to you? Not anymore." The whole street was quiet now. Neighbors coming out of their houses, some with their phones out recording. It was like the neighborhood finally had something better than Netflix to watch. Greg tried to calm us both down, but it was too late. Karen was ranting about how she was going to have me fined, kicked out of the HOA, maybe even evicted. I just laughed. "Go ahead," I told her. "The police have the footage. You're the one who's about to have a court date, not me." That shut her up for a second. She stomped back into her house and slammed the door, so hard I heard something fall off her wall inside. Greg muttered something about needing to bring this to the next board meeting and slunk away. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that maybe Karen would finally realize she'd messed with the wrong guy. But I underestimated how petty she could be. The next morning, I woke up to find a notice taped to my front door. It was an official HOA violation letter, citing me for creating a disturbance, unauthorized towing, and even damaging neighborhood harmony. I almost laughed out loud at that last one. Damaging harmony? This wasn't a Zen garden. It was a suburb full of people who couldn't stand each other half the time. But then I saw the fine. $250. Due in 10 days. That was when I stopped laughing. I wasn't about to pay a dime to these people, especially not when they were using their little HOA power trip to protect a criminal. I wrote back, attaching the police report and my security footage, and told them that until Karen paid for damage to my car, I wouldn't be entertaining any fines or notices. 2 days later, I came home from work to find a second notice, this one threatening further penalties if I didn't comply. I knew what they were doing. They were trying to wear me down, force me to give in just to make the problem go away. But I wasn't wired that way. If anything, the more they pushed, the more stubborn I became. By the end of that week, I had installed 3 more cameras, including one facing Karen's house, just so she knew I was watching. I also started documenting every single thing she did. Every time her dog pooped on someone else's yard, every time she left her trash cans out past pickup day, every time she parked slightly crooked. If they wanted a war, I was going to give them one, and I was going to play by their own rule book. Word started spreading around the neighborhood about what was happening. And to my surprise, more than a few neighbors quietly came by to tell me they were rooting for me. Apparently, Karen had been terrorizing people for years, writing them up for minor violations, gossiping about them in the Facebook group, even getting people fined for having kids' toys left out on the lawn. Most people just paid the fines or kept their heads down, but me towing her Lexus had lit a spark in the whole neighborhood. The next HOA meeting was packed. People who hadn't shown up in months came just to see the fireworks. I walked in with my arms full of printed evidence, photos, reports, timestamps, and took a seat right up front. Karen sat across the room from me, glaring like she could set me on fire with her eyes. Greg tried to keep the meeting civil, but it didn't take long before the shouting started. Karen accused me of being a menace, of endangering the neighborhood atmosphere, whatever that meant, and tried to convince the board to fine me again. That's when I stood up, slammed my folder of evidence on the table, and played the security footage on my laptop for everyone to see. The room went dead silent as Karen's face appeared on the screen, key in hand, dragging along the side of my Challenger while her little dog wagged its tail. Gasps echoed around the room. Someone in the back actually said, "Are you kidding me, Karen?" Another neighbor muttered, "She did the same thing to my husband's truck last year." Suddenly, the whole room was talking. People shouting over each other, demanding she be removed from the board. Greg tried to gavel everyone into silence, but it was no use. The tide had turned. Karen was red-faced, sputtering, accusing me of doctoring the video, but no one was buying it. By the end of the night, the board had voted to suspend her pending investigation, which was basically their way of quietly admitting she was guilty. When I walked out of that meeting, I felt 10 feet tall. For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I felt like the balance of power had shifted, but I also knew Karen wasn't done. People like her never give up quietly. Sure enough, later that night, as I sat in my living room, I saw headlights outside my window. Karen's Lexus hadn't been returned yet, so she was driving her husband's pickup. She slowed in front of my house, sat there for a moment, then peeled off, tires squealing. It was a warning, but I wasn't scared. If anything, I was ready. The very next morning, I woke up to the sound of a car horn blaring. At first, I thought it was just some impatient driver outside the neighborhood, but when I stepped outside, I froze. My Challenger was covered, completely covered, in bright pink paint. The entire hood, roof, and trunk were splattered with what looked like half a dozen gallons of neon paint. It dripped down the windshield, pooled under the wipers, and ran in long, ugly streaks down the sides. My jaw locked, my fists clenched, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. This wasn't just vandalism anymore. This was a declaration of war. Neighbors were already gathering, whispering, phones out to take pictures. One of them, an older guy named Jim who had lived there for 15 years, shook his head and muttered, "She's lost her mind this time." He didn't even have to say her name. I knew exactly who had done it. Karen might not have been dumb enough to do this herself after getting caught on camera last time, but I had no doubt she had someone do it for her. I went straight back inside, pulled up the security footage, and sure enough, there it was, 2:37 a.m., a shadowy figure in a hoodie and gloves walking up my driveway with a paint bucket. They worked quickly, throwing paint across the car, even taking the time to splash them on the driveway just for good measure. I couldn't see their face, but I could see which direction they ran when they were done. Straight toward Karen's house. I called the police again, sent them the footage, and filed another report. But this time, I didn't stop there. I printed out still frames of the footage and stapled them to a letter I put in every single neighbor's mailbox. The letter explained what happened, included a QR code linking to the full video, and ended with a very clear message. This is not just my problem. This is about every homeowner who's been bullied or intimidated. Stand with me, or this will keep happening. By the afternoon, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. The Facebook group was on fire. Half the people were siding with me, furious that Karen was dragging the whole community into chaos, and the other half were too scared to take a side. Karen, predictably, was online claiming she had nothing to do with it, and that I was harassing her with my propaganda. That night, Greg showed up at my door again, looking more stressed than I'd ever seen him. He told me the board had called an emergency meeting because tensions were getting out of control. I told him I'd be there, and that I had even more evidence to present. He rubbed his forehead like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days and said, "Look, off the record, I don't even like Karen, but you've got the whole neighborhood at each other's throats. This is getting dangerous." "Good," I said, locking eyes with him. "Maybe it's about time people stop being afraid of her." The emergency meeting turned into a circus. Neighbors came in groups, some bringing folders of their own complaints against Karen. Everything from petty fines to threats she'd made. I played the new footage on projector I had borrowed from work, showing the entire room what had been done to my car. People gasped, cursed. Some even booed when they saw the figure running toward Karen's house. Karen, of course, went nuclear. She stood up, screaming about how this was slander and defamation, and threatening to sue me for emotional distress. That was when I pulled out my trump card, a notarized letter from my insurance company stating that they were pursuing a civil claim against whoever was responsible for damage, using my footage as evidence. "You sue me," I said, my voice calm but ice cold, "and I'll countersue you for every cent it costs to repaint my car. And since the cops already have the footage, you'll have to explain to a judge why a vandal ran straight to your house after doing this. Go ahead, Karen. Take me to court. I dare you." The room erupted. People were clapping, some shouting, "Yeah," and about time someone stood up to her. Greg banged his gavel, but it didn't matter. Karen was losing control of the room, and everyone knew it. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to strip Karen of her authority, pending the police investigation. She stormed out, swearing under her breath, her face red as a tomato. But I wasn't celebrating yet. People like Karen didn't just slink away quietly. And sure enough, 2 nights later, I got my first real scare. It was just after midnight when I heard a noise outside, a scraping sound near my garage. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my phone recording just in case. There, crouched near my Challenger, was a man I didn't recognize, holding what looked like a crowbar. He froze when my light hit him, then bolted toward the street. I chased him halfway down the block before he jumped into a waiting car and sped off. The next morning, I reviewed the footage again. The guy had been trying to pry open my garage door. This wasn't just about vandalism anymore. This was about intimidation. Karen was getting desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. I installed motion-activated floodlights, reinforced the garage door, and even parked my old truck across the driveway so no one could get close to the Challenger without triggering an alarm. And just for good measure, I called my buddy with the tow truck again and asked if he'd mind keeping Karen's Lexus at his impound lot a little longer. He laughed and said, "For you? I'll keep it as long as you want. She can pay the daily fees when she wants it back." By now, I wasn't just defending myself. I was on the offensive. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board demanding that Karen be permanently removed for endangering residents, attached every piece of evidence I had, and CC'd my lawyer just to make it clear I wasn't bluffing. The neighborhood was starting to change. 2. People were speaking up more, calling out Karen publicly instead of whispering behind closed doors. A group of neighbors even started a petition to change the HOA bylaws so that board members could be voted out by a simple majority instead of waiting for the yearly election. I signed that petition with a smile. But even as the tide turned, I could feel the tension building. I knew Karen wasn't done. I could see her watching me from her window sometimes, her face tight with fury. She stopped walking her dog past my house, but every once in a while, I'd find a new petty notice on my door: grass too long, trash bin out of compliance, holiday lights still up, even though it wasn't even close to Christmas. I kept every single one of those notices, filed them neatly, and added them to my growing folder of evidence. If Karen wanted to keep pushing, I was going to make sure she paid for every push. The final straw came a week later, when I received an official letter from the HOA's attorney threatening legal action if I didn't pay my outstanding fines for the violations Karen had written up. That was when I knew I had to go nuclear. I called my lawyer, handed over every scrap of evidence I had, and told him I wanted to sue the HOA for harassment, damages to my property, and emotional distress. He read through everything, whistled low, and said, "You've got them. This is airtight. They're not just going to settle, they're going to fold." And that's when my plan shifted. It was no longer just about defending myself. It was about taking the HOA down completely. The day I filed a lawsuit was the day everything shifted permanently. My lawyer, Mark, was one of those sharp, no-nonsense guys who had built a reputation for tearing HOAs apart when they overstepped. The moment we walked into the county courthouse, he was already strategizing out loud, rattling off case law and statutes that would make the HOA's attorney sweat bullets. "You've got video evidence, police reports, insurance claims, and a record of harassment," he said. "This isn't just a lawsuit. This is a takedown." When the HOA received the summons, I swear you could feel the ripple of panic across the neighborhood. Karen went completely silent on the Facebook group for the first time since I'd moved in. Greg came to my door the next evening, his face pale, asking if we could discuss a possible settlement. I told him politely but firmly that we let the court decide. The weeks leading up to the trial were some of the most surreal of my life. Everywhere I went in the neighborhood, people stopped me to ask for updates. Some even dropped off copies of their own HOA violation letters, hoping my case might set a precedent for them too. By the time the court date rolled around, I had an entire binder full of not just my own evidence, but testimonies from over a dozen neighbors who had been harassed, fined, or intimidated by Karen and her clique. The courtroom was packed the morning of the first hearing. I wasn't surprised. Word had spread far beyond our neighborhood, and apparently, people from other HOA-controlled communities nearby had come to watch. Even the local news station sent a reporter. Cameras rolling as I walked up the courthouse steps in my best suit. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. This had become something bigger. Inside, Karen sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her usual perfectly styled bob looked limp, and she kept glancing nervously at the HOA's attorney, who was flipping through paperwork like he wished he were anywhere else. Greg was there too, looking miserable, and a couple of other board members sat behind him, whispering urgently. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Mark stood up and began laying out our case with precision, presenting the timeline of events, the security footage, and the harassment notices. He played the videos on the big courtroom screen, and even the bailiff leaned forward to watch. The judge's eyebrows rose higher with every clip. Then Karen's attorney tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no proof Karen had personally ordered the vandalism. That's when Mark smiled like a wolf and dropped our bombshell, a sworn statement from one of Karen's so-called friends, who had come forward to admit that Karen had bragged about teaching me a lesson and even offered to pay for extra paint if the first act of vandalism wasn't enough. Karen's face turned beet red. She slammed her hand on the table, shouting that it wasn't true, but the judge banged the gavel and told her to control herself. That was the moment I knew we had won. Over the next few hours, Mark systematically dismantled the HOA's case. He showed that the fines they had issued me violated their own bylaws, that they had failed to act impartially when I presented evidence against Karen, and that their attorney's threats of legal action amounted to harassment under state law. By the time we rested our case, the HOA's defense looked like a house of cards ready to collapse. The judge didn't issue a verdict that day, but you didn't need to be a lawyer to know how it was going to go. When we walked out of that courtroom, people I didn't even know clapped me on the back and shook my hand. The news crew stuck a microphone in my face, asking how it felt to stand up to the HOA. I kept my answer simple. No one should have to live in fear of their neighbors. This ends today. When the ruling finally came 2 weeks later, it was everything I had hoped for and more. The judge ruled in my favor on every count. Karen was ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my challenger, plus my legal fees, plus punitive damages for harassment. The HOA itself was fined for mishandling the situation and was ordered to rewrite its bylaws to include stricter checks on board power. Karen lost her seat on the board permanently. The very next day, a moving truck appeared in front of her house. She didn't come out to say goodbye to anyone. By the weekend, the house was empty, the curtains drawn and a for sale sign hammered into the lawn. I should have felt satisfied, and I did, but more than anything, I felt relieved. The constant tension that had hung over the neighborhood for months seemed to lift overnight. People started talking to each other again, waving when they drove by, even inviting each other over for barbecues. The Facebook group went from being a battleground to being a place where people shared lost pet alerts and yard sale announcements. My Challenger, by the way, got full professional repaint. Better than factory finish. Paid for entirely by Karen's restitution check. The day I picked it up from the shop, I drove slowly down the street, windows down, engine rumbling, feeling like I just won a war. Because, in a way, I had. But there was one last thing I had to do before I could truly close the chapter. I went back to the next HOA meeting, not as a victim this time, but as a resident who finally had a say in how things were run. Greg was still there, but he looked humbled, and the other board members seemed a lot less smug than usual. When the floor opened for nominations, I stood up and put my name in the run for a board seat. The room erupted in applause. I won by a landslide. Taking my seat on the HOA board was surreal. Just months ago, I had been sitting at home, fuming over my vandalized Challenger, and now I was officially in a position to make meaningful change. The first thing I did was call an emergency meeting with the remaining board members. I wanted to address the policies that had allowed Karen to operate unchecked for so long. Rules about fines, board authority, dispute resolution, all of it needed a complete overhaul. I proposed a series of reforms designed to ensure transparency and fairness. First, every fine had to be documented with clear evidence and justification, not just a board member's personal opinion. Second, homeowners were given a clear channel to appeal any violation without fear of retaliation. Third, board elections were made more democratic, with term limits and anonymous voting to prevent any single personality from monopolizing power. The board members grumbled at first, but there was no room for argument. The community had witnessed what could happen if abuse of power went unchecked. Over the next few weeks, I worked tirelessly. I met with neighbors, solicited their input, and even created an anonymous suggestion box system for anyone who didn't feel comfortable speaking in public. It was exhausting, but I could see the difference immediately. People began talking to one another again. Lawn decorations no longer caused whisper complaints. Trash bins no longer became a political issue. The neighborhood felt alive, like it had finally been freed from a shadow that had hung over for years. And of course, I made sure to keep my Challenger safe. I installed additional security cameras, reinforced the garage doors, and even set up a system to alert me if someone got too close to the vehicle at night. I wasn't paranoid, I was prepared, and after everything that had happened, I knew that taking preventive action was a necessary part of reclaiming my life and my property. The social transformation in the neighborhood was almost as satisfying as the legal victory. Families who had once kept their heads down and avoided conflict began organizing block parties, holiday events, and neighborhood cleanups. It was as if removing Karen's influence had unlocked a collective sense of community. People started to genuinely care for one another instead of worrying about arbitrary rules or vindictive board members. I couldn't help but smile when I saw kids riding bikes down the street, without fear of a neighbor complaining about safety hazards. By the time the next HOA annual meeting rolled around, I had become a central figure in the community, not just because of my lawsuit victory, but because I had shown that one person could make a difference. I presented an annual report highlighting the positive changes, the new fair policies, and the community projects that had started since Karen's departure. There was applause at every turn, and for the first time in years, the room felt genuinely celebratory. Even Karen's former allies seemed to step back. Some had sold their houses, moved to other neighborhoods, or simply stayed quiet. It was clear that the toxic culture she had fostered couldn't survive without her presence. And for the first time since the nightmare began, the entire street felt safe and livable again. As for me personally, I had gained far more than just victory over a vindictive neighbor. I had earned peace of mind, respect for my community, and a newfound sense of empowerment. My Challenger, spotless and roaring with life, became a symbol not just of personal success, but of resilience and justice. Every time I revved the engine or polished the glossy black hood, I remembered the long, difficult battle it had taken to get here. It wasn't just about a car. It was about standing up, taking action, and refusing to let someone else dictate your life or property. Months later, one quiet evening, I stood on my driveway, watching the sun set across the street. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the cul-de-sac. Neighbors waved from their lawns, and the community felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. I took a deep breath, knowing the peace I had fought for wasn't fragile. It was built on evidence, courage, and persistence. I knew that while there would always be petty conflicts in any neighborhood, the system was now stronger, fairer, and immune to one person's tyranny. Karen was gone, The HOA reformed, and I could finally drive my Challenger without a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The battle had been long and exhausting, but victory tasted sweeter than I could have imagined. Every scar on my car, every tense moment in court, every sleepless night spent documenting evidence. It had all been worth it. I had turned chaos into order, intimidation into empowerment, and fear into freedom. Standing there, looking at the house I had defended and the neighborhood I had helped reclaim, I realized something. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a story that others could take hope from. That if someone in your community tried to bully or intimidate you, if an HOA tried to abuse its authority, there were ways to fight back, legally, strategically, and effectively. And that knowledge, more than anything, was priceless. I got back into my Challenger, started the engine, and felt a familiar roar vibrate beneath me. The streets were quiet, the neighborhood peaceful, and for the first time in months, I smiled without reservation. I had fought, I had won, and I had helped my community heal. And as I drove slowly down the street, windows down, engine growling, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them, head on, unafraid, and victorious. The end.